All right, everyone, grab a seat and welcome to class. I'm your host, and today we've got a really fascinating explainer lined up for you. We are time-traveling back to the 1980s to unpack an absolute political earthquake. I mean, this was a massive shift that completely rewired how Americans thought about government, taxes, and personal responsibility. We're talking, of course, about the conservative revolution and the rise of Reaganomics.
So let's just jump right in with our do now for today. You know, everyday families are still deeply impacted by political debates over taxes and funding for hugely popular programs like Medicare. The tension between how much the government should tax us versus how much it should actually provide in services, that isn't just ancient history. It's literally the exact same debate we're having this very morning. And to understand why those fault lines exist today, we absolutely have to understand the 1980s.
Okay, here is our game plan for today's explainer. 1. The turn to conservatism. 2. Key vocabulary. 3. Reagan in his own words. 4. The economic impact. And 5. A quick summary and pop quiz.
Let's set the stage. Section 1. The turn to conservatism.
Before the 80s rolled around, the dominant political philosophy was rooted in these democratic Great Society programs. The basic idea was to heavily use government intervention to try and fix social issues. Well, conservatives pushed back hard against this. They argued that these programs were just making citizens way too dependent on the government. Plus, they felt the government had just grown too big, was far too expensive, and was completely stifling the free market. Their solution? A return to traditional values and letting free markets operate without all that government interference.
Now, what's really fascinating here is how conservatives positioned themselves politically. They basically framed themselves as the essential cure to what they saw as decades of growing chaos. They pointed to the 1960s, the counterculture, the protests, the riots, and they paired that with the pretty rough economic stagflation of the 1970s. The conservative argument was essentially a massive call for law and order, and they painted the opposition as being soft on crime and ultimately responsible for the country's decline.
All right, Section 2, Key vocabulary. Get those notebooks out.
First up, conservatism. Now, political labels can kind of change over time, but actually, let's be specific. During this exact era, it meant a really strict favoring of traditional social values, a strong reliance on free market capitalism, and a general opposition to rapid, sweeping societal change.
Next up is Reaganomics. This is the defining economic strategy of President Ronald Reagan. The entire foundational goal here was to shrink the footprint of the federal government. And how did they plan to do that? Primarily by pushing through massive tax cuts, paired with attempts at significant cuts to government spending.
And our third term is deregulation. This is the systematic removal, or at least a big decrease, of government rules on businesses. The theory is pretty straightforward. If you cut the bureaucratic red tape, businesses are going to be free to innovate, expand, and ultimately spark a ton of economic growth. Okay, moving on to Section 3, Reagan in his own words. Let's hear it from the man himself. He had this literally unforgettable line. He'd say, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, 'I'm from the government and I'm here to help.'" The crucial takeaway here is that Reagan genuinely viewed government intervention not as some helpful lifeline, but as a direct threat to everyday self-reliance and individual liberty.
And when it came to the economy, he was always hammering home this message. The problem is not that people are taxed too little. The problem is that government spends too much. He wanted everyone to know that the financial squeeze everyday families were feeling wasn't because the government lacked revenue. It was because of an absolute excess of government spending. It was a total 180 from how the previous generation viewed Washington.
And wow, did that message ever land with voters? The 1984 election resulted in an electoral map that was just a massive sea of red. President Reagan won re-election in a historic landslide, crushing Walter Mondale by 525 electoral votes to 13. The conservative message had absolutely won over the country.
So the philosophy was a hit, but what about the actual results? Section 4, the economic impact.
When we look at the gross domestic product during the 80s, the trajectory is super clear. The decade actually kicked off with a really severe recession. We're talking negative growth in 81 and 82, but then, boom! As Reaganomics kicked into gear, the economy completely reversed course. By mid-1983, GDP growth was spiking over 9%. So, from a pure growth standpoint, these policies sparked a massive boom.
But, as your trusty, impartial explainer of facts, I've got to show you the whole picture. While the economy was rapidly growing and massive hikes in defense spending helped the U.S. project power to ultimately win the Cold War,
There was a really severe mathematical consequence. You combine lower taxes, which means less money coming in, with drastically higher military spending, more money going out, and what happens? The federal deficit and the overall national debt violently spiked upward. It essentially kicked off a long-term debt trend that we are still dealing with.
All right, pencils ready? Section 5, Summary and Pop Quiz. Let's see what stuck.
Let's do a super quick review first. Under Reaganomics, the overall economy went up, defense spending went up, the deficit and debt way up, and government regulation went down. Keep this visual locked in your mind. It's honestly the perfect cheat sheet for this entire era.
Okay, pop quiz time. Question 1. Think back to our early comparison. According to the conservative critics, what did they argue were the major negative outcomes of those 1960s Great Society programs? Remember, they firmly believed it made people too reliant on the government, creating this cycle of dependency, and that the whole thing was simply too big and way too expensive.
Question 2. Let's see if you remember the data. What exact combination of policies drove that national debt upward during the Reagan years? If you said massive tax cuts combined with huge increases in defense spending, you nailed it. Less revenue coming in plus more spending going out guarantees a larger deficit.
All right, question 3. This one is straight from your upcoming test. Which action did President Ronald Reagan support to achieve economic growth? 1. Increasing spending on social welfare. 2. Cutting defense budgets. 3. Increasing regulation. Or 4. Lowering taxes on corporations and individuals. Based on everything we just covered, the clear answer is number 4, lowering taxes to stimulate that free market.
And that is a wrap. But before you pack up, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. When we look at the incredible national debt that everyday families and taxpayers are facing right now, today, we have to ask ourselves, are we still paying the price for the structural deficits that started in the 1980s? Or are we still coasting on the incredible economic growth and global stability those victories achieved? The history is written, but the debate, that's still very much alive. Thanks for hanging out for today's Explainer, and keep learning.